So let's now move on to the next presentation with Zacharia TIEMTORÉ, Chair of the Superior Human Security Institute and former Minister of Literacy in Burkina Faso.
Merci, c'est à vous.
Over to you.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Hello everyone.
Vous me permettrez d'adresser mes
If you allow me, I will start by thanking the organizing team for this event. Congratulations. And I believe that in my presentation further on, you will understand why I believe this initiative deserves to be supported. So congratulations and thank you for inviting me. I've heard some great presentations from very experienced specialists, very detailed presentation, but with me it'll be slightly different. We will try to do a bit of philosophy, although some might think it's useless. I don't know what you think, but if the eyes can see what our spirit can imagine, and you basically see with your spirit rather than your eyes, you will understand why it's sometimes necessary to question the way we think, because that's really the starting point. And I co-founded the Institute about 10 years ago, and we are convinced that we can be an input through training, analysis, but also in our meetings and in the dialogues that can be organized. So I've called this presentation Thinking Development in Relationship with the Living, What Inputs from African Philosophies. And you'll understand this or why in a moment. Earlier, you presented the situation in Africa. Since this morning, we've heard some figures, some examples, and you are right when you say that this year there's a serious heat wave happening. I didn't come directly from Burkina Faso, but just a few weeks ago, I was there. It was very hot. And lots of people died, a lot. This is not accounted for, so it can go unnoticed sometimes, but yes, I believe this year everybody had this question. I heard several testimonies saying we've never gone through this. So something is happening. The rain started way earlier.
Pourquoi? Mais il a commencé déjà à pleuvoir et certains paysans sont en train de semer.
Some farmers are already seeding the soil. Will there be an interruption in the rain? We don't know.
Vous l'avez dit, des rendements agricoles qui sont de plus en plus faibles.
The agricultural yield is decreasing. The food insecurity is increasing, and the life of the living is threatened. The life of the living. Which a thinker like Membe is thinking about. We no longer need to be all on one side of the problem, but together be on the same side to look at the problem and see how it can be resolved. There's no solution that is purely African or European, but there are solutions from the citizens carried out by the living to support the living. Some may have thought that we would all agree in front of this reality, we would have the same perception of the reality. But no, what we can see in certain regions, including in West Africa, is that despite what might seem obvious to most of us,
des perceptions plutôt étonnantes. Et là, j'ai choisi de vous
But there are some
présenter
surprising
trois
perceptions
grandes
as well, and I've
perceptions qui
decided
émergent.
to present three of them,
Celle,
three
qui
emerging
pourrait être
perceptions,
celle de beaucoup d'entre nous.
one
Ce
that might be
pragmatisme
shared
adaptatif.
amongst
On comprend
most of
qu'il y a
us.
une situation qui est difficile.
Adaptative pragmatism. We understand it's a difficult situation and we try to adapt, see what we can do differently. Some might call this a transition. We do everything we can to get information, to understand and see how we can act. But we live with our own realities. And next to this perception, there's another one,
se demande si tout ça en fait existe.
wondering if all this is
C'est ce que
true.
nous avons appelé le scepticisme nihiliste.
This is what we call nihilistic
Est-ce que tout ça finalement ça n'est
skepticism.
pas
Wondering whether this is not a
pour nous empêcher de nous
lie to prevent us from developing ourselves? This is what we call the anti-development conspiracy. And I've heard people saying it
c'est du pipeau.
very clearly. Climate change is a lie.
Nous n'ayons pas accès
It was invented so that we don't have access to development.
un refus, un déni
So there is a denial
de cette situation
of
plutôt difficile.
this reality, which is quite
Troisième
difficult.
perception
A
que
third
l'on
perception, which can be
rencontre
found
au territoire,
in our
c'est ce que nous avons
territories,
appelé le
is what we
fatalisme
called
rédhibitoire.
redhibitory
En
fatalism.
fait, ces personnes nous disent ça sert à rien.
These
ce que vous êtes
people
en train
tell
de
us
faire.
what you're doing is
Dieu est en
useless.
train de prendre sa revanche
God
sur des
is
attitudes qui
getting
sont
revenge
totalement, en fait,
on your attitudes
destructrices
that
et
are
anormales.
destructive and abnormal.
Vous n'avez rien à faire. Dieu remettra
So
tout dans le
you
bon
don't
ordre.
have to do anything because God will put everything back in order.
C'est une façon, en fait, de dire tout
It's a
simplement
way
que
to say
oui, c'est
that
normal que
yes,
aujourd'hui,
it's
il pleuve
normal
plus
that
que,
it
on en a
rains
besoin,
more
c'est normal.
than we need
Ils
now,
comprennent pas, ils
that
n'acceptent pas
they
l'idée
don't
que,
accept
l'homme,
the
par son
idea
action,
that men,
pourrait
through
être
their
à la base de
actions,
ce que l'on vit. Mais
could
c'est plutôt,
be the root cause for what we're
l'affaire
going
de-
through, but that it's rather
divine.
a divine business.
Tout ceci
And
nous amène en fait
all
sur le
this
territoire à être
takes us
dans des
to
réponses qui questionnent,
bringing
parce que, ok,
responses that
on fait
raise
quoi
questions. What do we do
au changement climatique face à ce qu'on
in front
constate
of
qui est
global
inhabituel.
warming and anything that we
Changement climatique.
observe
Qu'est-ce
as
que l'on constate Qu'est-ce que l'on fait
unusual?
Vous avez,
What do we do?
des réponses parfois totalement différentes.
Sometimes
Il y en a qui,
the
considèrent
answers
que,
can be very
il
different.
faut
Some
peut-être
consider
renoncer au développement
that we should
et organiser
give up
une vie autrement.
on development and
Et du coup,
organize
on
our
se pose
lives
la question
differently.
de qu'est-ce que le développement finalement
So
À l'aune
that
de
raises
ce
the question of
constat, à l'aune
what
de ce
development
changement
is.
climatique, c'est
In the
quoi le
face
développement
of
pour les
climate change,
Africains
what is development
Parce
for
que pendant
Africans?
longtemps, le
Because for a
développement
very
pour les
long
Africains,
time,
c'était ressembler
for Africans,
à l'Occident
development
et aux
was
Occidentaux.
looking like the West and
Et
the
encore
Westerners,
aujourd'hui.
and still today.
Du coup, si les Occidentaux
So
nous disent,
if
attention,
the people from the West
non,
tell us,
pas
no,
ce
no,
chemin-là,
no,
parce que
don't take this
ça
path
mène,
because it
vers
takes
une impasse,
us to a
ben,
dead
pour
end,
les Africains qui suivaient,
then
parfois ils essayaient
for the
même de
Africans who were
rattraper.
following and were
C'est
sometimes
finalement
even
ça,
trying
on
to
dit,
catch
on
up,
essaie de rattraper quoi,
are
Est-ce qu'on est
being told,
véritablement
what are
en
you
retard
trying to catch up on? Are
Mais
we really
aujourd'hui,
late? But
On
today,
voit bien que
we can
se
see
pose, ce débat.
that this
On n'a
debate
pas
is on the
réponse.
table. We don't have
On
an
ne sait
answer
pas
to it.
comment,
We don't
qualifier le
know
développement,
how to
qu'est-ce qu'il
qualify
faut,
development,
présenter comme étant
what
le
should be
développement.
presented as
Mais on
development,
est plutôt d'accord
but
qu'il,
we
il
pretty
faut,
much
c'est pour ça
agree
que on est très regardant sur ce que nous avons
on,
appelé ce
and this is
soubresaut
why
de prise de
we
conscience,
keep an eye
qui,
on those
permettent,
awareness
en fait, de lutter
upheavals,
contre les épistémicides.
which
C'est quoi les épistémicides?
allow
Et
us
notamment
to
les
fight
endo-épistémicides. C'est vous décidez sur votre territoire que
epistemicide.
vos savoirs en fait,
Epistemicides. What is
finalement ne
this?
sont pas des savoirs.
Knowing that knowledge in the territory is not knowledge,
Répondent pas aux standards
simply
de la
because they do
science
not
telle
meet the
qu'elle est
criteria
présentée,
of
telle qu'elle est
science
promue.
as
Et donc,
presented and
vous avez
promoted.
tendance vous-même à
So one
dévaloriser
tends
ce que vous
to
savez faire, ce que
devalorize
vous
what
maîtrisez,
you know,
et à essayer
what
d'aller
you
chercher
master,
des
and to
solutions
try
ailleurs
and
et de
find
façon
solutions
différente,
elsewhere,
parfois,
and
que vous ne maîtrisez pas.
methods that sometimes you don't master and that you don't have access to. And with those trends that are emerging, which is to promote endogenous knowledge, local knowledge, and I believe the next speaker will actually give a few examples of this, especially in agriculture, that relies on existing knowledge in order to find solutions. So we are trying to encourage those trends in order to get out of endo-epistemicide by questioning rationality. What is rationality? Is it singular? And one of the answers that we present today is that rationality has different meanings or different forms. And if it's the case, this would mean that you might think what you're doing is not rational, but since there's not one single rationality, why stop? So, public policies. I was lucky enough to be part of high-level decisions in the past, and we observe an imbalance where politics must also adapt to their time. Their narrative depends on the context, but very quickly they come back to what they know best. We need to meet the needs of millions, and we won't stop doing this because for now we don't have the means to do things differently. So there's a real gap between official speeches and the decisions made. A few years ago, there was an attempt to make plastic bags illegal in Burkina Faso, with an attempt to create a law for this, and 10 years later, plastic bags are still in use in big volumes. That was just an example. Some might wonder what to do. Shall we try to repair the current society model, or shall we try to build a new one? And that's where it's not easy, because attempts to repair have been going on. Today we're talking about transition, but we could wonder how long the transition should last. How many years should we have to make the transition effective? And once you've resolved this issue of the timing, what is the expected result in the end, at the end of the transition? Did we fully resolve the issue? If we reach that target of 1.5 degrees, is the issue resolved? Nonetheless, we might not have the answers yet, but we're not sure that the problem would be resolved. And creating a new model is like repairing a truck while driving it. I don't know if you can, but for now, it's quite concerning. And we can see it's not easy. It doesn't mean we cannot dare to try. But some thinkers support this idea of decentering ourselves, meaning being able to put yourself in the skin of others. That is empathy perceived by philosophers. And putting yourself in the skin of another one is also a way to feel what others can feel, and therefore being able to give up on part of ourselves for another one, which relates to one of the philosophies that I have included in today's presentation. In African beliefs and the strong ideas carried by communities, there is an idea saying that everything lives, that the living is not just humans, it's also a plant, the grass, that when you cut part of the living, you talk to the living and ask them for their permission and almost apologize. when you hear it here, it might sound funny to some. Let's call it this way. But this is a philosophy that organizes the entire life. If everything is intertwined and our world needs balance, it might be because those balances have been stopped that we're suffering from the consequences. And if we could share some of this philosophy, which is not unique to Africa, it can also be found in the Asian cultures, especially with the legend of the gluten tapir. I don't know if you know it. It's an Indian legend where a tapir is struck by lightning through the gods because they took a bit too much of the forest, more than they needed. And the idea is to remind humans that the forest is there, yes, you can use the forest for your needs, but not take more than what you need and more than what the forest can regenerate. Another philosophy, which is sometimes presented in the Bantu or southern part, is what we call Ubuntu philosophy, but also in Maya, Western Africa. So this same idea can be found, meaning I is within us. Individuals only exist through the us, and the us gives an individual their strength and their purpose. And in the educational models, there is what we call the African initiation, and as part of this initiation, it's done per age classes, meaning that everyone is responsible for one another. And when you think about it, this need to feel like you belong, when you look at the pyramid of needs, you know, the Maslow pyramid, this need to belong is also a translation of this Ubuntu philosophy. You need to feel like you belong. And even when you showcase individuals, individuals are looking for the sense of belonging. And in this philosophy, it says that if we all shared it, we might have a different perception of the world, not only from the West or the African perspective, and Richard talked about it earlier. We now know that the world cannot be only Western. This is impossible. If Africa were to follow the Western model, I think the planet could not handle it. Kizerbo has been saying this for more than 20 years. When globalization will fail, and it has, or it is, becoming a failure, it does not only produce poverty, but pauperization. And in that moment, having the correct attitude will be needed. And here's a few suggestions. First of all, the extremes. Yes, we've also always talked about extreme poverty, but not enough about extreme wealth. As if extreme wealth were not an issue at all. We believe that extremes, be it extreme poverty or extreme wealth, is weakening the society and the living. And we need to address both. Let's be honest. We are going to face a challenge, the challenge of bias. While I'm talking, I'm sure there's an active bias, either a compliance bias or the confirmation bias. And any of the two are biases that can take us away from the solutions, because we can see that few people are willing to give up on a lifestyle. And the question today is whether we would agree to give up on our lifestyle, because it's that model, amongst others, that is simply not sustainable.
Le sacrifice qui permet en fait de passer de l'abondance à la
And that sacrifice that allows us to move from abundance to sufficiency, and that's typical of humans.
Les besoins ont été satisfaits.
Okay, our needs have been met. What's the next step?
Je sais pas si on fera comme les Indiens.
I don't know if we'll be like Indians. You know this philosophy. When a person dies, a person spends their life accumulating wealth, and then they have to give everything back. They need to be stripped out of their wealth before the end of their life, getting ready to leave just the way they came, naked, without anything, almost stripped of everything. And that also raises the question of the purpose of life.
Depuis finalement hier et particulièrement ce matin avec toutes les interventions qui
I don't know, what is your perception today, especially after all the presentations we've had?
Jusqu'où l'humain est capable de comprendre que quand on parle du vivant,
how deep is the understanding of humans of the living? Yes, humans are part of the living,
il n'y a pas que l'humain.
It's not just humans.
Finalement, la mort,
and ultimately, death makes life exist. Death needs life, life needs death, and chaos can also be the start of a new life. However, once you've heard this, you might be a little discouraged. It can work today, but maybe not every day. So we want to remain optimistic by saying that we can still do certain things by ourselves, and if we decenter from ourselves, as proposed by Unique, then we will be able to navigate this ocean of uncertainty with some certainty islands, as per Edgar Morin. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you so much for taking us into philosophy, which is food for thought for ourselves. And we've got a few questions. First question on this transition from abundance to sobriety. In this context, the knowledge of indigenous peoples might be a way to preserve African countries from becoming fatalist as we are in the north. It could be. But the question is, do the Africans want this? This is a luxury of people like us to say this, and to propose giving up on abundance for sobriety. But for an African person under their tree, at the end of their day, hoping that one day they will also access something else, that's a question. And this is why we think it's important to overcome the obstacles between people like us, who have access to information, who try to think and organize ourselves, and populations who have had this dream sold to them for years, and they're running after this dream. So I don't know if I'm proposing this is to question people, but I'm not sure local populations would actually would like that. But yes, if this were accepted, it might be a way to protect a model that we also gave up on, not just through colonization. And that's why I'm talking about self-epistemicide. After colonization, there was a possibility to have a different thinking, but we can see that we were not able to seize those opportunities, and it might be happening now. We'll see in 60 years. Do you think animistic religions could be in strength in Africa to imagine a truly sustainable development? And if so, how could this be implemented? So, animist religion, I'm not sure that's the right wording. Because they live with the environment and they consider that nature leads everything and that nature always pays its debts. So they learned how to live with nature and to listen to nature. And today, it's a model that is also in danger. It is hard to find areas that are completely preserved from any influence, some sort of islands that could not be conquered, and where life continues as normal with a certain philosophy. No. What I presented to you are things that are under influence and weakened and that could not be found in their rawest form. Let's imagine those philosophies are still strong. Could they be a way to protect people from global warming? Yes, I think so. And if you look at how the way we're working, it's abundance. We're only trying to meet a need and not to accumulate. And if you don't accumulate, you look at what you need today, you produce it, you use it, and that works day by day. Regarding nihilistic skepticism, how could education or literacy be a way to limit this thinking?
Je me suis battu pendant des années pour promouvoir l'alphabétisation.
I fought for years to promote its use because I believe in this literacy. I believe in literacy. It's to give the means to people to have access to knowledge, but to also access their own knowledge. Whereas for now, they have access to the knowledge produced by others, but not to their own knowledge. And at the end of the day, people become educated, but you make people even further, you take them even further from their territories. School was one of the biggest reasons for a rural exodus. Because look at the programs, look at what is taught in school. So we didn't manage to readapt curricula after colonization. We kept the same curricula. So for literacy, if programs are different, and if we teach populations to connect back to themselves, their territories, to learn, to like and consider their territories again, because at the end of the day, it's based on this, that they will manage to have their roots, their feet down to earth, and to also make the most of the wind blowing their way, because technological progress is also pleasant. It's very useful and important, but at the same time, we've sacrificed a lot for technological progress. It's not only about education and literacy and increasing the literacy rate, it's also about looking at the content. What are we teaching in terms of curricula and training, so that we reconnect to territories and to the philosophies can happen and have an impact, because One day, there might be a meeting such as the one we have today, with local populations, with African populations that could dialogue with us, that have a dialogue with us. And to do that, how could we do that? Well, how are we going to end up in danger because we don't understand the codes, and they might end up in danger because sometimes they don't have access to what we are discussing. And this is why we need to stop being self-centered. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Et nous allons poursuivre